The crust of the bread was a weapon against her own ribs. Lynn ran, the stolen loaf tucked inside the worn fabric of her tunic, each jarring step a fresh punishment. Dust coated her tongue, a gritty film that tasted of panic and the dry summer heat of the Nevada territory. Behind her, miles back in the small, clapboard town of Redemption, she imagined the baker's shout was still echoing, a sound that had morphed into the thunder of unseen hooves in her mind. She did not know if they were actually searching for her, but the fear of it was a spur in her side. A single loaf of bread. After weeks of hunger, of promises of pay from the laundroman that turned to dust just like the road, it had felt like a fortune worth stealing. Now, it felt like a stone that would drag her to the gallows. The mountains shimmered in the distance, their peaks a hazy purple promise of wilderness where a person could disappear. But between her and that promise was this valley, vast and empty save for a single, desperate scar of a ranch carved into the land. A cabin, a corral, and a barn stood like lonely teeth against the endless blue sky. It was a place of profound solitude, and for a woman running from the law, that could mean one of two things: a final, merciless end, or a slim chance at refuge. Her lungs burned, her legs screamed, but she pushed onward, her eyes fixed on the thin curl of smoke rising from the cabin's stone chimney. Hope was a more painful spur than fear. She stumbled the last 100 yards, her vision tunneling until the weathered gray wood of the cabin door filled her sight. She fell against it, her small fist beating a frantic, weak rhythm that was barely louder than her own ragged breaths. The loaf of bread tumbled from her tunic, landing in the dust with a soft thud. For a long moment, there was no answer but the buzz of flies and the vast, indifferent silence of the frontier. She was about to give in, to let the dust reclaim her, when the door groaned open. A man filled the doorway, tall and broad, his form a dark silhouette against the cabin's dim interior. He was not old, but the sun had carved deep lines around his eyes and mouth. He looked down at her, then at the bread in the dirt, his expression unreadable. He had the stillness of a man who spent most of his time with horses and cattle, a patience that was neither kind nor cruel, but simply there. Lynn pushed herself up to her knees, her hands clasped together in a desperate plea. Words failed her. Her English was a clumsy tool, cobbled together from shouted orders and insults. "Please," she whispered, the word a dry rasp. She pointed a trembling finger back the way she had come, toward the town she could no longer see. "Man, with star, come." The rancher, Silas Blackwood, looked in the direction she pointed. He saw nothing but the heat rising in waves from the valley floor. His gaze returned to her, then to the bread. He understood enough. Trouble was riding toward his ranch, and it had the face of a terrified Chinese girl. He had built this life on a foundation of solitude, a deliberate turning away from the world and its entanglements. And now, one of those entanglements was kneeling on his porch, offering him nothing but her own desperation. He should have closed the door. He should have pointed her toward the mountains and told her to keep running. But he did neither of these things. Instead, he bent down, picked up the loaf of bread, and brushed the dust from its hard crust. He stepped back, holding the door open. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. And be quiet. It wasn't a welcome, but for Lynn, it was a reprieve from death. She scrambled inside, into the cool darkness of the cabin, the scent of wood smoke, leather, and coffee filling her senses. Silas closed the door, and the world outside, with its unforgiving sun and its approaching lawmen, vanished. For a moment, she could breathe. He broke off a piece of the bread and handed it to her, along with a dipper of water from a wooden bucket. She drank greedily, the cool liquid a shock to her system, then chewed the dry bread with a focus that bordered on feral. Silas watched her, his arms crossed over his chest. He was a man who measured his world in acres, in heads of cattle, in the changing of the seasons. This woman was an unknown quantity, a variable he could not account for. She finished the bread and water and looked at him, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and fear. The cabin was a single room, furnished with a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a cot, and a stone fireplace. His rifle was propped against the wall near the door. It was the home of a man with nothing to hide, which made the secret he was now keeping all the more dangerous. He had just opened his mouth to ask her name when a sound carried on the wind, faint at first, then growing steadily clearer. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, but several, moving at a steady, purposeful pace. Silas's face, already grim, hardened into a mask of stone. He glanced at Lynn, then jerked his head toward the small sleeping alcove, which was little more than a cot tucked behind a threadbare curtain. In there. Do not make a sound. Do not even breathe, you hear me? Lynn didn't need to understand every word. The urgency in his voice was a universal language. She scurried behind the curtain, pulling her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. She could see a sliver of the main room through a gap in the fabric. She saw Silas take a deep breath, his shoulders squaring as he moved to the door. He didn't pick up the rifle, a deliberate choice she didn't understand. He opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door partially closed behind him, shrouding the cabin's interior once more in shadow. Outside, 3 riders reined in their horses, their leather tack creaking in the sudden silence. The man in the lead wore a dusty vest and a silver star that glinted fiercely in the sun. He was a gaunt, tired-looking man with a drooping mustache and eyes that had seen too much. Blackwood, the sheriff, a man named Finch, said. It wasn't quite a question. Finch, Silas replied, his voice flat. He leaned against a porch post, his posture deceptively casual. Long ride for a social call. Not social. Finch's gaze swept over the ranch, taking in the empty corral, the quiet barn, the still cabin. We're tracking a thief. Chinese girl. Stole bread from Abernathy's bakery this morning. Seen anyone pass this way? Small thing, quick on her feet. Lynn held her breath, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it. The moment her fate would be decided by a man she did not know, a man who owed her nothing. She watched the sliver of Silas's back, a wall of faded cotton between her and the law. She saw the minute tensing of his shoulders, the slow clench of his fist at his side. He could give her up. It was the easy thing, the sensible thing. It would cost him nothing and rid him of a problem he hadn't asked for. The silence stretched, thin and taut. A horse snorted, shaking its head against the flies. Finch's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin under the oppressive heat. Well, Blackwood? Have you or haven't you? Silas pushed himself off the post. He turned his head slightly, as if looking back into the dimness of his home, though Lynn knew he couldn't see her. When he faced the sheriff again, his expression was unchanged, but the words that came out of his mouth hit the dry air like a physical blow. Haven't seen a soul pass this way all day, he said, his voice even. He paused, then added, just me and my wife. The lie was so bold, so utterly unexpected, that for a moment, no one spoke. Finch stared at Silas, his mouth slightly agape. The other 2 deputies exchanged a look of disbelief. Silas Blackwood was known throughout the territory as a solitary man, almost a hermit. The idea of him having a wife was as strange as snow in July. Your wife? Finch repeated, his voice laced with suspicion. Since when did you take a wife, Silas? About a month ago, Silas said, the lie now building on itself, creating its own terrible momentum. Quiet affair. Didn't see the need to announce it to the whole territory. He gestured vaguely toward the cabin. She's shy. Doesn't take to strangers. Finch was not a man easily fooled. He had been a lawman for 20 years, and he had learned that the most isolated places often held the darkest secrets. His eyes, small and sharp, scanned Silas's face, searching for a crack in the story. Is that so? Well, I'm afraid I'll have to trouble her. Procedure, you understand. I need to see her face. Lynn's blood ran cold. Behind the curtain, she began to tremble. This was a new, unforeseen terror. She had to become a wife. She had to perform a life she couldn't imagine for a man she had just met, with her freedom hanging on every gesture, every look. Silas didn't hesitate. He turned and pushed the cabin door fully open. Mary, he called into the gloom. The name was a stranger on his tongue. Come on out here a moment. The sheriff wants a word. His voice was calm, but Lynn could hear the steel beneath it. It was a command. She took a shaky breath, smoothed down her tunic, and stepped out from behind the curtain. The sudden brightness of the afternoon sun made her squint. She kept her eyes downcast, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the very picture of a timid, subservient wife. She walked slowly to the doorway and stood just behind Silas, letting his frame partially shield her from the men on horseback. Finch leaned forward in his saddle, peering at her. He said. "Sorry to bother you. We're looking for someone. You seen any strangers today?" Lynn risked a glance up at him, then quickly looked away. She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. She trusted her voice even less than her composure. Silas placed a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was both a comfort and a cage. "Told you, Finch." "She's shy," he said. "Doesn't speak much English, either. We get by." The lie deepened, taking on the texture of truth through sheer audacity. Finch continued to stare at Lynn, his gaze intense. "What was your name again?" he asked, his voice sharp, testing her. The question was a trap. Lynn's mind went blank with panic. The name he had called, she had to remember the name. Mary. She had heard it spoken in the town. It was simple. American. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Mary," she whispered, the sound so faint it was nearly lost on the wind. "Mary Blackwood," Silas added firmly, his grip on her shoulder tightening just enough to convey a silent instruction, "Stay calm." Finch grunted, still not entirely convinced. He was a dog with a bone, and something about this sudden marriage smelled wrong. "You from around here, Mary?" Silas answered for her before she could hesitate. "Her family worked the railroad camps up near Sacramento. That's where I met her. Her folks passed on last winter. I brought her out here." Each detail was a stone laid on a weak foundation, but he laid them with such conviction that they seemed solid. He was building a fortress of lies around her, and she was the trembling secret at its heart. One of the deputies, a younger man with a nervous energy, shifted in his saddle. "Sheriff, we're burning daylight. If he says he ain't seen her, he ain't seen her. She's probably halfway to the mountains by now." Finch shot the man a glare that silenced him, but the point was made. They were wasting time. He looked from Silas's implacable face to Lynn's downcast one. There was no fear in the man, and the woman looked exactly as he described, timid and foreign. There was no way to prove the lie without tearing the man's home apart, and Finch didn't have the warrant or the inclination for that, not over a loaf of bread. With a sigh of frustration, he finally straightened up in his saddle. "All right, Blackwood. My apologies for the intrusion." He tipped his hat in Lynn's direction, a gesture of civility that felt like a threat. "But you keep your eyes open. This girl we're looking for is a thief. No telling what else she's capable of." He gathered his reins. "If you see anyone, you send word." "Will do, Finch," Silas said, his voice unchanging. The sheriff and his men turned their horses and rode away, their departure stirring up a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after they were gone. Silas and Lynn stood on the porch, not moving, not speaking, until the sound of the hoofbeats had faded completely into the vast silence of the valley. Only then did Silas remove his hand from her shoulder. The connection broken, Lynn's legs gave way, and she sagged against the doorframe, the strength leaving her all at once. He watched her for a moment, then went back inside the cabin. He didn't offer comfort. The lie he had told was not an act of kindness. It was a transaction. He had bought himself a complication, and now he had to figure out what to do with it. He poured a cup of coffee from the pot warming by the fire and sat down at the table. The space between them was filled with the unspoken weight of what had just happened. He had claimed her. In the eyes of the law, she belonged to him. The thought was as unsettling as the sheriff's departing glare. That night, they shared a meal of bacon and beans in near silence. The sun had set, and the cabin was lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. When the meal was over, Silas finally spoke. You need to tell me your name. Your real name. Lynn, she said softly. Lynn, he repeated, testing the sound of it. Why were they after you, Lynn? And the truth this time. The whole truth. With her halting English and a series of gestures, she told him everything. She spoke of the laundry in Redemption, of the long hours and the back-breaking work. She described the owner, Mr. Abernathy, a man whose smiles were colder than his threats. She explained how he had held back her wages week after week, promising to pay her what was owed but never doing so, claiming she had debts for her food and lodging that she could never seem to pay off. She was trapped, effectively his property until he decided otherwise. The hunger had become a gnawing pain that overshadowed everything else. Stealing the bread hadn't been a choice, it had been a final, desperate act of survival. Silas listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamp flame. The story was a familiar one on the frontier. Men like Abernathy thrived in places where the law was thin and people were disposable. When she was finished, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was filled with a shared understanding. He had not rescued a common thief. He had intervened in a piece of casual cruelty. Abernathy is not a man who forgets a debt, real or imagined, Silas said, more to himself than to her. Finch might be done with this, but Abernathy won't be. He looked at her, his eyes clear and direct in the lamplight. The lie I told today, it holds. From now on, you're Mary Blackwood. You work here. You cook, you clean, you tend the garden. You earn your keep. When you see anyone riding up, you make yourself scarce or you play the part. We don't give anyone a reason to look twice. Understand? Lynn nodded, a profound sense of relief washing over her. It was a harsh bargain, trading one form of servitude for another, but there was a difference. She had seen the look in Silas's eyes when he faced down the sheriff. It wasn't the look of a master, but of a man defending his territory. For now, she was part of that territory. She was safe. Weeks bled into a month. A routine, fragile at first, began to take hold. Lynn rose before the sun, stoking the fire and putting coffee on to boil. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the quiet language of a life lived far from the noise of towns. She discovered a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin and coaxed it back to life, her hands finding a familiar comfort in the soil. Silas was a quiet presence, leaving before dawn and returning after dusk, his days spent mending fences or driving his small herd of cattle to better grazing in the high meadows. They rarely spoke more than a few dozen words to each other in a day, but a language of shared tasks and mutual reliance grew between them. He would leave a broken tool on the porch, and find it mended in the morning. She would find a pail of fresh milk waiting for her by the door, a silent offering. One sweltering afternoon, as Lynn was weeding the garden, she saw a rider approaching. It wasn't the sheriff. This man rode a fine horse, and he sat in the saddle with an air of arrogant ownership. As he drew closer, a cold dread seized her. It was Abernathy. She ducked inside the cabin, her heart pounding. Silas was miles away, up in the hills. She was alone. She heard the horse stop outside, the creak of leather as the man dismounted. Heavy boots thumped on the porch. Blackwood, a voice called. It was a voice she heard in her nightmares. I know you're in there. I've come for what's mine. A fist hammered on the door. Lynn backed away, her eyes darting to the rifle propped against the wall. She didn't know how to use it, but the sight of it was a small comfort. The hammering stopped. There was a scrape of a boot, then Abernathy's face appeared in the window, his features twisted into a sneer. He saw her. His eyes lit up with a possessive fire. There you are, you little thief, he hissed through the glass. Thought you could hide out here? Your contract ain't up. You belong to me. He moved back to the door and began to shoulder it. The wood groaned, the latch straining. Lynn's mind raced. There was nowhere to run. The door shuddered again, and with a crack of splintering wood, it burst open. Abernathy stood there, his bulk filling the doorway, a cruel smile on his face. Now, he said, taking a step inside. You're coming back with me. And you'll work off every cent you cost me. She's not going anywhere. The voice came from behind Abernathy, low and cold as a winter wind. Silas stood there, not 10 feet from the porch. He held no gun. His hands were empty at his sides. He must have seen Abernathy from the ridge and come down, moving with a silent speed that was more unnerving than any shouted threat. Abernathy spun around, startled. Blackwood. This ain't your concern. This is between me and my runaway property. She's my wife, Silas said, the words flat and final. He took a slow step forward. And this is my land. You're trespassing. Abernathy laughed, a short, ugly sound. Wife? Don't make me laugh. Everyone in town knows you're a hermit. You bought yourself some company, is that it? Well, you bought stolen goods. She's mine. He reached inside his coat, but before his hand could find what it was looking for, Silas closed the distance between them. He didn't throw a punch. He simply moved, grabbing the front of Abernathy's coat with one hand, his grip like iron. He slammed the bigger man back against the doorframe, the impact rattling the entire cabin. You came onto my property, Silas said, his voice a low growl, his face inches from Abernathy's. You tried to break down my door. And you threatened my wife. Now, you can ride out of here and forget you ever knew her name, or you can stay here. If you stay, no one will ever find you. The buzzards get hungry this time of year, and the mountains don't give up secrets. Do you understand me? There was no heat in his voice, only a chilling certainty. Abernathy, a bully used to intimidating those weaker than himself, found himself looking into the eyes of a man who was not bluffing. He saw the promise of a swift and brutal end. Fear, acrid and real, finally broke through his arrogance. He nodded, his face pale. Silas held him for a moment longer, then shoved him away. Abernathy stumbled back, catching his balance. He shot a hateful glare at Lynn, then scrambled onto his horse and galloped away without a backward glance, leaving a trail of dust and defeated rage. Silas watched him go, then turned and looked at Lynn, who was still standing frozen in the middle of the room. He walked over to the shattered door and examined the broken latch. I'll fix this in the morning, he said, as if nothing had happened. But everything had. The first lie had been for the law. This time, he had drawn a line against the world, and he had placed her firmly on his side of it. The seasons turned. Summer's oppressive heat gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn, and then the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks. The fixed door was a silent testament to the day the world had tried to break in and failed. The lie of their marriage had settled into a quiet truth. They were not husband and wife in the eyes of God or the law, but they were partners, bound by a shared solitude and a debt that could never be spoken of. One afternoon, a freight wagon rumbled up the path, the driver bringing supplies and mail, a rare connection to the outside world. He handed Silas a single, thick envelope. Inside, Silas found 2 documents. One was the official deed to a small, 40-acre plot of land adjacent to his own, registered with the Territorial Land Office. The other was a set of legal papers, drawn up by a lawyer in Carson City, granting a woman named Mary Blackwood full homesteading rights to that land. That evening, he laid the papers on the table in front of Lynn. She looked at them, then at him, her expression confused. "This is yours," he said, tapping the deed. "Land. A name. No one can touch you now. Abernathy can't claim you. The law can't touch you. You're not a runaway. You're a homesteader." She picked up the papers, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar name. Mary Blackwood. The name was a shield he had given her. The land was an anchor. She looked at the map, at the small square of earth that was now hers. For the first time since she had left her home across the ocean, she owned a piece of the world. Tears welled in her eyes, silent and slow. "Silas," she began, her voice thick with emotion. He just nodded, accepting her unspoken gratitude. He had spent years building walls to keep the world out. But in letting her in, he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. The silence in his cabin was no longer empty. He looked at her, at the strength and resilience that had survived so much. The lie had served its purpose. It had become a bridge to a new life, for both of them. A small smile touched his lips. "It's a good piece of land, Mary." She looked up from the papers, the tears still shining in her eyes, and for the first time, she corrected him, her voice clear and strong. "My name," she said, "is Lynn." He met her gaze across the small wooden table, and in the quiet understanding that passed between them, a new truth was born, more solid and lasting than any lie. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.